Welcome to Soaring the Sky, a glider pilots podcast. Hello, my name is Chuck. I will be your host. This is episode 29. This episode is brought to you by Arizona Soaring Incorporated, the nation's largest provider of professional glider training. Since 1969, they provided training from initial private through CFI glider and entry level through advanced aerobatics. Open year-round, 7 days a week. More information is available at azsoaring.com. Today on the podcast, Jim Zombakis joins us. After a flight with a friend in his super decathlon and about 4 or 5 aerobatic flights with him, Jim was hooked. He started taking training soon after in Frederick, Maryland, where he obtained his private pilot single-engine license. After a lot of $100 hamburger runs and taking friends on an occasional flight, life got busy with 2 children and a busy consulting career that included a lot of traveling. Jim started flying a lot less, and it wasn't until when he was driving home in Florida that he spotted a glider and followed it to where it landed, at Zephyr Hills. Jim there took his first glider flight, and again he was hooked. He received his glider add-on rating in July of 2016, and then purchased his own glider in February of 2017, a Jantar 2. Now Jim has already put approximately 200 hours in that glider. He also has obtained his silver badge in April of 2018. Today we join Jim flying his first competition right now on Soaring the Sky. Jim Zombakis, welcome to Soaring the Sky. Glad to have you today. How are you?
Very good. Good. Glad to be here.
When did your aviation adventure get started?
I got my power license way back. I think it was in 1985. I got my power license, thought I was going to continue on forever and ever, and I flew for about 10 years in power. And as it happens, life gets in the way. I had some children, and I stopped flying for a good number of years, probably about 10 or 15 years. Got out of aviation altogether. I was traveling quite a bit with work and just didn't have time for it. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I lived down here in Tampa, Florida, and I was driving down the road and actually saw a glider in the air. And I was just on a mission to find out where the glider was coming from. And I was able to find Tampa-based Soaring, which is at Zephyr Hills Airport here in Central Florida. And that kind of started my glider career. I went up for a ride one day and immediately was hooked. And that was about 3 years ago. And here I am going stronger and stronger. It's become a full addiction for me.
I can definitely understand that one.
Yep.
So where did your journey take you? You started taking soaring lessons, and how did that go?
It went great. Again, I hadn't been in an aircraft, piloting an aircraft in 10 or 15 years. Got in a glider. It was a Grove 103, I think, for my orientation ride. And I think as most people get into gliders, they immediately realize the rudder actually does something in a glider.
Yeah.
versus a power plane. So that was my first recollection of, wow, those pedals are actually necessary in a glider. And it just kind of got my interest. And, you really have to fly the aircraft. It requires a lot more coordination and focus, I feel, than even in some of the power aircraft. But just got hooked. I got I soloed. I couldn't tell you. It seemed like it was fairly quick. And just couldn't get enough flying. I very quickly got my hours and did my check ride and got my glider added to my license, private glider, and I was off to the races. I tried to fly every aircraft we had at the club, just get as many hours as I could, as quick as I could. In hindsight, it was probably too soon, but about 6 months after I got my license, I was on Wings and Wheels, like most of us do on the weekend, and I ran across a Jantar. It's a 1980 Jantar 2, which is a beautiful Polish single-seater fiberglass glider, and just fell in love with it from the pictures. And a few weeks later, it was being delivered down here to Florida for me.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
So how did that go? Was it ready to go, or did you have to get the annual on it?
I forget. I think I did have to get an annual. I think it had just expired. when I bought it. I'd had a lot of conversations with the gentleman I bought it from up in Ohio. He sent me hundreds of pictures. Really well maintained aircraft, and more of a formality. I think we did an annual here just to look under the covers and make sure everything was good with the glider. And I did ask my flight instructor, my original flight instructor, if he wouldn't mind taking it up on its maiden flight, thinking he knows how I fly, and he had an idea of what I do right and what I do wrong, and he fell in love with the glider. I think he thought it was more of a sporty aircraft than he was expecting. It's a nice fast airplane, and I just immediately I couldn't he gave me felt like about an hour long cockpit checkout in the aircraft, but it's probably only a minute or so. I was just so anxious to take it up. And I think on my first flight in that glider, I probably was up for 2 hours just horsing around the airport, feeling it out.
So was there a big transition from what you're used to flying, or was it pretty easy?
Amazingly easy. I joke around with other members at my field that it's, in my opinion, is extremely docile, high performance glider. And I'm not sure why there's not more of them here in the country than there are, but I joke around and say it's a very fast Blantic. It's just a good, fast airplane with really no bad flying qualities. Stalls straight ahead. It gives you plenty of warning if you're getting into a slow situation, and it's a very solid, heavy aircraft. So I really feel like it's a good aircraft to learn your take on as your first high performance, because it can take a lot of abuse. It seems to be a very rugged, strong built aircraft.
It sounds like a nice, safe glider.
Yep, I really love it.
So you bought a glider and you're ready to go. Where did you go from there?
Just a lot of flying. Again, I joked around with you and said it's become a full-fledged addiction now. If I'm not flying, I'm thinking about the next time, the next weekend or the next nice day that's coming up where I can fly. So I just started to rack up hours. I think I did about 70 hours in the aircraft the first year that I owned it, and really almost immediately, as soon as I got the glider, started to get interested in cross country. Not necessarily racing, but just pushing further and further, trying to get further and further away from the airport, and learning to test your skills and your courage as you get away from the airport. A lot of the members where I fly cross country is just not a high priority. We have, I believe it's 6 club aircraft, and we don't encourage people to go cross country unless you have somebody experienced with you in the aircraft. So I really got a kick out of just jumping in the glider and going away as long as I could, as far away as I could.
What's the glide ratio on that?
The book says it's 40-1. I have to believe it. I think I have an Odie that I fly with. It seems to capture it at about 38 or so to 1, but it's plenty. So there's another member. There's actually 2 members that I fly with. One gentleman named Bruce Patton, and another member named Randy Morningstar. And all 3 of us kind of have the same inclination. I think we all enjoyed the challenges of cross country flight and getting away further from the airport, and it just naturally turned into, okay, once you're comfortable flying longer distances, then it becomes, well, how can I do it faster? How can I go further, fly faster so that you can go further and still make it back to the airport? And that's those 2 guys have really helped keep that energy alive in me, also with pursuing that type of flying.
So recently you flew a competition, correct?
That's right. First competition, and again, it was the 3 of us, Randy, Bruce, and myself, signed up for this. It was the Region 5 South. It was in Cordele, Georgia. I just blanked out. I think it's the first week in June of this year.
So how did that go? Walk me through it. You show up, you bring your glider.
Yeah, we had no idea what to expect. We went there completely naive to what was expected or what was required. We did actually meet with a gentleman named Rich Owen, who is based out of Seminole Lakes. I think he's actually won a national competition here in the U.S. just a few years ago. But he did come to our club and give us about a 2-hour presentation on the process, what to expect at the races and how they're organized, and how the different days and scoring and so on. So we did have we had, if you will, a textbook understanding of what to expect, but none of us had ever done this before. So you show up, not really knowing what, how serious people take this or how aggressive everyone's going to be at these races. But it was a really neat experience for sure.
So can you set up the terrain for me? Were there mountainous areas? Was it mostly flat? What was the terrain there in Georgia?
Very flat, very flat. There are the particular area. I'm not even sure if you would call this eastern Georgia, but it's very flat area. Farmland, a lot of cotton fields, just very wide open spaces, and there are some areas that are have lakes. So there are some water areas that you learn to avoid out there. The biggest difference, same terrain, if you will, down here in Florida. The biggest difference, and I don't know if it was just the time of the year that we were up there, but the skies were, the cloud bases were double of what they are down here in Florida. It was very common not to get into the cloud bases until 8,000 feet out there.
Okay.
Yeah, we're down here in Central Florida. 4,000 feet is pretty much the norm. That was a complete learning curve for me because you're not used to actually having to climb that high to get into that top band.
How big was the contest, I guess, as far as distance? How did that work? How many turn points? How far? How was that set up?
Okay, so it was a 6-day contest, if I remember right. The last 2 days or 3 days actually got rained out, but it was, I believe, scheduled to be a 6-day contest. Rich Owen, I mentioned earlier, he actually was the contest director for this event. He did a great job picking the task. So I was part of the sports class. Randy, Bruce, and myself were part of the sports class, being our first entry into a contest. And I want to say when the weather was good, which it was most of the time, it was extremely hot, but the weather was very good for soaring most of the days that we were there. Those tasks were, I think, 160 miles is probably a good average for the days that we flew. For the nominal, average differences, I think some of them you could have gone over 200 miles if you flew all the way to the outside perimeter of each of the turnpoints.
Oh, that's a lot of flying.
Yeah, and especially the type of training we were doing back here in Florida, I want to say the largest task that we flew was maybe 80 miles. So it was night and day. I remember looking at the contest sheet the first time it came out, and I said, I've never flown that kind of distance. I did have my silver badge, and I think I might have just done 140 or 150 miles that day on the silver badge. I did all 3 pieces, but I've never flown, as long as we flew, as far as we flew, and definitely have never flown it trying to be fast, over that big a distance. So that was a real shock or a real eye opener when I saw that the first time.
So it's the first day. You all are getting in the gliders. You're going to start the race. How did that go?
You're dry mouth because everything's happening fast. There were let's say there were roughly 30 gliders at the contest. So I think there were many more gliders there than they typically get. And just in the sports class alone, I think there were roughly 20 gliders in that class. So they would hand out, we would have a pilots meeting in the morning, 10 in the morning. They would go through weather briefings, safety discussions, talk about how we're going to grid, where we're going to grid, things like that. And we would start to grid around noon. And I mentioned to you, it was abnormally hot. It was approaching 100 degrees every day that we were there. So you wanted to spend as little time sitting on the ground in your glider. So, generally we would grid all the gliders either on the side of the runway or actually on the runway. And, just before your cycle came up to where they started launching, you would, you strap yourself in and just try and stay as cool as you could until they hooked you up and started to tow. And we had, on some of the days, we actually had 5 tow planes launching. So there was just rapid succession launches. Everything happened real fast.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So how did that first day go once you got in the air?
Amazing. I mean, it was very exhilarating. Number one, just to be in the air with that many gliders. Again, back home, there might be 3 of us flying together, practicing for a task. And I want to say half the time we would lose sight of each other. It was very hard to keep a group together. And then when you launch at this contest, you're surrounded by gliders, and it's just a different experience. But again, we had actually come up a few days before the contest to do some practice flying. One of the GTA races was actually going on at the airport the week before, so we had an opportunity to practice and get used to the clouds and the weather and so on in the area. So the first day was kind of, you're just heads down, focused on getting to that first turn point. As soon as you left the start cylinder, it was all kind of you just become very focused on getting to that next cloud or to where you thought the next area of lift was, and trying to keep your speed up as best you can.
How were the thermals that day?
They were not great early in that. We launched, let's say we launched around 1 o'clock, or we started the race around 1 o'clock. I do remember they weren't as good as they were the few days before that we had been there. But so you felt, maybe it was psychologically, because I know I want to not spend too much time thermaling, and I want to start getting downrange towards the first turn point. And the thermals weren't quite as strong. They were somewhere +2s to +4s. But you were able to get up high, and that, as you know, that takes a lot of stress out of the situation. That you always feel comfortable when you're at 4,000, 5,000 feet. You feel like you can go out anywhere, and that helped. And then as the day progressed, the thermals picked up significantly. They were all +4 to +8. I mean, some of them were extremely strong.
Yeah, so you're good to go once the afternoon kind of kicked in.
Exactly. And you're pretty far away from where you started, so it's I guess the biggest difference for me there was that I know when I was back home, you always have in the back of your mind, you know the area pretty well, and you kind of can visualize, I'm this far from home, and if I land out here, this is where somebody can come get me, whether they fly you out or have to trail you out. When you're in a foreign area, a foreign location, I noticed I didn't think about what was behind me. I didn't think about how far I was from Cordele Airport. I just focused on how far I was from that next turn point. So that was probably the biggest psychological difference for me. It dawned on me about halfway through the first race that I wasn't at all focused on how far I was from home. It was, am I on schedule? Am I doing this at the right pace? Thinking about getting to the next turn point, looking at the clouds, anything you could find that would help you, find the most direct route to those next turn points.
Do you know what your average speed was that day?
That day, some people listening to this may laugh, but that day was good for me and for the other guys that were flying. We were probably flying in the mid 40 mile an hour, 45, 46 mile an hour. Obviously, some of the contestants there fly much faster, but for us, when we were practicing, we were probably flying in the 40 to 42 mile an hour average across a task. So I was kind of surprised that the speed had gone up. And again, considering what a long task these were, that our speeds held up. They were actually a little better than we had done up to that point. And I think the guys that won that day were averaging just over 50 miles an hour, or maybe just below 50. So we weren't, it wasn't like we were, they were laughing at us and we couldn't keep up with the pack, but it was a good fun day.
And obviously, for those people that don't know, your speed is, calculated not only, of course, when you're traveling, but you have to calculate when you're in a thermal, and you're at zero basically when you're in a thermal because you're not going anywhere.
Exactly. The actual flight speeds, I can speak for myself. I was trying to fly anywhere between 70 and 80 knots in the aircraft whenever I wasn't thermaling. I was trying to get to that next thermal at about that speed. I must have been doing something right, because I found myself catching up with some of the gaggles that I hadn't flown with yet. So I'd be making my way to a cloud, and as you got closer, you'd look up, and sure enough, there were 3 or 4 gliders already there, circling. So that kind of gave you a good feel that you were doing something right. That you were staying with some of the in this case, some very high performance gliders. So it was a nice comforting feeling that you weren't completely out of the picture for the race.
Now, did they do any handicaps for the gliders, or was it more of, like you said, they put you in a sport category?
Yes. The sport category. I'm not quite sure even what that classification means, because I think there was an 18-meter ship in there. There were definitely some higher performance modern ships, AS 27s, and I think even a 29. So I'm not sure what the boundaries are to be eligible to be in the sports class. But there was a broad range. I'm in a 40-year-old Jontar. We had one of our other members was in a Grove 104, a Speedosteer. Another member was in he was in another fairly high performance glider. So, there was just a broad range, and then the handicap obviously played into that for each of the gliders.
So that first day, did everybody make it back? Was there anybody that had to land out?
There were, as I recall, I think there were 2 people out of, let's say there were 20 again in the sports class. I think there were 2 that landed out very early. I mentioned the lift was not really strong in the beginning, so I think there were 2 that landed out by the first turn point. And then other than that, it was just, again, it was how fast you could make it around the course. It was I don't remember the exact distance, but I know there were 3 turn points, and we did have for safety reasons, we did have a minimum altitude coming back to the Cordele Airport. I think at 4 miles, I think you had to be at, I don't recall the exact numbers, but it was something along the lines of you had to be at 1,800 feet, 4 miles from the airport as you're coming back. And I think that caused some of the guys that were racing back, I think that caused some problems there where they had to stop and circle to get a little bit higher so that they could cross the finish cylinder at a high enough altitude.
How did you finish up that first day?
I did amazingly well. I believe I came in 7th that day.
Nice.
And yeah, totally. My goal that day was to finish, not land out.
Exactly.
Finish. I was thrilled to finish. I should have looked at this before we talked, but I believe I came in 7th that day, and the race director actually wrote something very interesting they do a daily recap. The problem I had was I actually got back 10 or 12 minutes early for the task. So there's a minimum time allowed for each task. And I think as I was making it back close to the airport, I just got excited that I was going to complete the race. And I think I didn't know how to pace myself and say, how do I get back slower? I knew I was under the time limit, but I thought it wouldn't make that big a difference. But the race director wrote something interesting at the end of the day that had I stayed out, at my current speed and actually stayed out those additional 12 minutes, I would have came in 3rd place that day.
Nice.
My first contest. I was just blown away with that. So that was a very exciting way to do your first day of contest flying.
So you had a couple more days after that?
Yes. We had 4 more days. So as fun as the first day was, then I'm really psyched. The second day comes around, very similar weather, extremely hot. It was a little more blue that day, or the clouds were definitely spaced out much further, but they were very high. I think the ceilings that day were at some point were over 8,000 feet. So I go into the second day with a real a lot of energy, because I'm like, wow, I did so well the first day. I'm gonna win this day. And it started out great. Again, it was fairly blue, and I remember leaving the start cylinder, and all I could see was nothing. It was just blue all the way to the first turn point, which was not that far away. It was probably about 20 miles from the start cylinder. But I remember going, I've never flown 20 miles out into the blue. I got lucky. I think I ran into some lift. I did literally run into it. I wasn't looking for it. I just ran into it. Just kind of nursed it, and it seemed to be a very weak lift line. I wasn't coming down. I basically was probably, gaining 50 feet a minute. But I was able to fly straight ahead. I didn't have to stop in thermal, and if I felt like I was coming out of that line, I would nudge my direction, to the right or to the left until it felt like I was back in it. And amazingly, I flew that first leg, I don't think I stopped the thermal at all. Just a very interesting way to start the day, and it really got me pumped up. And matter of fact, in that first leg, there were no gliders in front of me. I got to the first turn point and looked around, and there were some nice clouds there, and I looked around, and there were no gliders. So I felt like either I had they had just left me sitting in the dust, or I was doing really well. And then the next turn point was a good ways away. I think it was another 20 or 30 miles to the next turn point. And I did happen to pick up some other gliders and made it much more comfortable for me anyways, just being in the vicinity of some other gliders. And if you were having trouble finding some strong lift, somebody else was finding it, and you all kind of play off each other. And then the biggest thing that stands out, well, there's two things that stand out to that day. So the third turn point, and again, I don't remember the exact distance, but it was in excess of 60 miles from the second to the third turn point. And that's that's just a long straight distance. And I do remember when I got the contest sheet or the task sheet that day, I'm like, that's insane. I've never flown 60 miles straight to another turn point. The really exciting thing for me was I got up very high. I think it was probably averaging around 7,000 feet.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah. And the clouds at that point were even much higher than that. They were above 8,000. I just didn't want to waste the time thermaling up to that altitude for speed reasons. Just, like you said, when you're thermaling, you got a big zero for airspeed. So you try and, minimize that. But on the third leg, I remember, number one, I was afraid because it was 60 miles going away from, it felt like it was going somewhat away from the airport still at that point. And the one thing I remember is I went very deep into the second turn point so that I could pick up a very long cloud streak that I saw that was heading generally in the direction from the second turn point to the third. I went out of my way, if you will. I flew perpendicular to the course I needed, but I was able to get into that cloud street. And the big thing that I remember on that leg was that I only had to stop and thermal once. I was able to stay into cloud suck, if you will, but I was able to stay in close to the clouds and generally was finding pockets of lift where I would just slow down enough to stay in it as long as I could, not turn, not thermal. I think I had gone about 40 miles doing that without having to stop and thermal on that course until about the last 20 miles. There was a little stretch of blue sky, and I did stop and get some altitude back to the third turn point. So that was I was happy again to have done that, with as little thermaling as I could coming across.
Yeah, just keep on rolling.
Right. So the day's going perfect, and as a matter of fact, my speed was averaging over, I think I was at 52 or 54 miles an hour on my OD for the task speed. So I was really pumped up. This is going to be a great day. I'm really going to do well. The final turn point heading home, I think it was 20 to 30 miles. I don't recall the exact distance, but this is where things went bad. It was later in the afternoon, later in the day. My OD, I had already turned to head home. My OD had told me that I had final glide made. So I'm very excited. And I was at about 6,000 feet. So I started to push the nose down, and I'm just going as fast as I felt comfortable in the glider. But I noticed that my arrival altitude was falling off abnormally fast, and I even thought something was wrong with the glider. I thought maybe my gear had opened. That had happened once when we were practicing, and it wasn't until I got about 10 miles from the third turn point that I realized I misread my OD. It was calculating final glide to the third turn point, not to the final, not to the Cordele airport. And I was above 4,000 feet. I wasn't immediately concerned, and the lift had been so strong that day. I said, well, slow down a little bit, and there were plenty of clouds out in front of me, and I said, there's been lift everywhere. You'll find something. I didn't have final glide made to the Cordele airport, but I was very confident, and I wasn't really at all concerned that I would find some lift and make it back home. Another 10 miles go by, and I did find small lift, but nothing worth stopping for. And long story short, I was about 6 miles from the airport when I knew I wasn't going to make it. If I just flew straight ahead, I wasn't going to make it to the airport. So I really had to do some soul searching, and I did try and find, looking at the ground, I found some small clusters of houses. I looked for things. I was probably down to 2,000 feet at that point, and I did get within several miles of the airport. I think I was down to about 3 miles to the airport now, but there was a long group of trees between me and the airport, probably about a mile wide swath of trees, and I knew. Number one, I knew that was not the smart move, was to try and make it over the trees and squeak out a landing right at the airport. So I did stop and just look for any lift that I could. And I think I got down to I was flying over a field that I had picked out to land out in. It was a fairly empty cotton field that had just been planted. It was sprouting. There were maybe 6-inch plants in that field. I knew that, if I couldn't find anything, that was where I was going to land. Very wide open field, very flat. And I looked and looked and looked, and it was frustrating because I could see the airport in the distance, but I just couldn't get enough lift to where I felt comfortable making that dash over the trees. And long story short, I was able to contact the race director and said, I'm 3 miles away. He probably could see me, to be frank with you, and told him I was going to land out, and that's what happened. So I landed out, and it was really, really tough for me because I had such a good day going that day, and other than the mental mistake of misreading or misunderstanding my computer, I really had a great day going. I didn't feel like I was being too aggressive. I was just flying the wrong speed, given the information that it was telling me. I should have slowed down and figured out that it hadn't moved on to the next turn point yet.
So had you landed out before?
Yeah, not in an open field. Back in Florida, I've landed out 2 or 3 times, but it's always been at some predetermined airport of some sort. I've landed once at a paved runway, which was one of my land out. That was one of my turn points, and I knew if I couldn't get past that point, that was going to be my go-to place to land out. And I've done that. I've landed out at 2 different grass airports in the area here. So again, there's not a lot different other than obviously you're looking for obstructions a lot more than you might when you go to areas that the areas that you're going to land out in are airfields to begin with. They're a little safer. The biggest surprise, and we had been warned about this, but the ground there is extremely sandy. So from the air, it almost looks like sand colored. And that's, again, they grow cotton in that area. And it was very flat. It was I want to say it was several hundred acres that I was landing into, a flat ground. And you could see the plant rows that they were planted. So I knew I was coming in, with the rows of crop, not against it. So I wasn't worried about running into any mounds, as I was coming down. But the instant I touched down, it was like, I felt like a lawn dart. As soon as the landing gear touched that soil, the glider just came to a stop instantly. It felt like it rolled 5 feet.
Oh my! And
just what you'd expect. You just kicked up all this dust, over the nose of the glider. So that was a big shock. And I, if anything, I touched down probably more soft than I usually do. One of my better landings. And I did actually land right in between two of the plant rows. So I was cognizant of trying not to damage the crops as I came in. So at least I had landed where I had planned, and I stayed out of the direct contact with the crops. But again, as soon as I don't know if it was my gear or even my gear doors, but as soon as I touched down, it just felt like it stopped instantly. But got out of the glider, no damage to the glider, no damage to me. I still had radio contact with the home field, so I was able to give them they saw me. I think I was close enough to the airport. They probably saw where I had chosen to land out. 2 of the members that I was there with actually grabbed my trailer, and it wasn't a place where they could have flown me out of it. So they came out in the trailer, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but it was a much harder task to get the glider out of that field than we had anticipated. It was later in the day. It was extremely hot. I was tired. They were tired. I think I was even dehydrated from from the flight, the time I was up in the air, as well as being on the ground trying to take the glider apart and so on. So it was a very strenuous activity to get the glider apart. We had to manually push the glider probably 30 or 40 yards in the, I keep calling it sand. Luckily, there was actually, if you know of those automatic sprinkler systems you see in these big crop fields where they move, they're on a large wheeled mechanism, and they might be several hundred yards long, but they actually, as they turn on the water, they start to move and walk across the field, if you will. Luckily, where I came to rest, I was only about 5 feet from one of the tire tracks of those sprinkler systems. So we were, otherwise we would have had to have rolled the glider up and over I call it the hedgerows, or the rows where they plant the crops. So we were able to push the glider along one of those tire tracks over to the side of the field. And again, it was probably about 50 yards, or it felt like it was at least 50 yards. And that's where they were able to bring the trailer in. And it was just a long, tiring, way to end the day, taking the glider apart. I think it probably took us 3 hours from start to finish to finally get out of there and back to the field that was just a few miles away.
What happens in a contest if you land out and you have a couple of days left? How does that work?
I just assumed it meant a 0 score for the day. But what actually happened is they give you the distance scored. So right up to the point where I landed, I got points for that distance that day. I did not get any points for the speed portion. So the scoring is made up of there's different ratios. Let's just say it's 60-40 distance points and speed points, and those two scores together are what you get scored for that day.
Okay.
So in that example, I left and we went out and had dinner that night, and I just assumed I got a big 0 for the day, and was surprised when I looked online to find out I got a decent number of points because I'd flown quite a long distance that day. I just came up 3 miles short to the airport. So it didn't, obviously if you were seriously competing and hoping to get first place, that was not going to help you landing out, but it didn't have a huge impact on my score that day. So I still felt very proud of the fact that I'd flown. I think I flew in excess of the average, the average distance of those tasks. Because again, I'd flown outside of one of the turnpoints quite a way just to get to that cloud street. So I was very proud of the distance I'd flown that day. I just ended a few miles short of the field.
So you have 2 more days left. Do you do the 2 days? What happened?
You absolutely could. To be honest with you, I was so tired. We didn't get back from getting the glider out of the field. We didn't get back till, let's say, 8 p.m. that night. I honestly was just too tired the next day. I voluntarily said, I want to be a ground crew today. I just didn't have the energy to jump in the glider. It was another 100-degree day. It was extremely blue day. I remember. I don't think there were any clouds near the airport. And I said, I'm gonna let my body tell me what's right. And I chose not to fly that day. The truth is, a lot of pilots, for different reasons, did not fly that third day. Sky was very blue. It was extremely hot. I think a lot of them were just tired also at that point. So a much smaller number of gliders went out, and I think there were actually a bunch of landouts that day. Again, because it was so blue. There just were no clouds in the area.
Yeah, and it's good to listen to yourself when it tells you, hey, I don't think I should fly today.
Absolutely. I tell my wife all the time, I'm one of the safest pilots I know, and maybe that means I'm too cautious. But my body was saying, no, you can take a day off. This is just a contest. It's just for fun. Enjoy it. Don't push yourself so hard, and possibly have a safety issue because of that.
Exactly.
And then the final day. So now day 4 comes around, and it's now the complete opposite of the previous days. A cold front was moving through. The clouds were much lower. I want to say they were probably at 4,000 feet maximum. There were rain showers starting to pop up in different areas. There was a lot of question whether or not we would even have a race that day. So what the contest director did is launched this sport class first, And a lot of pilots chose not to fly that day, I think because the weather just was not very good. He launched the sport class that was in that front group, and we basically were all just kind of sampling the weather. Were we able to stay up? Could we see further away? What did the weather look like, and so on? And it wasn't a great day, but it was definitely a flyable day. And they actually modified the task while we were in the air. I think it was going to be an 80-mile task, a much shorter task that day. And while we were flying, they changed everything. They changed the start location. They changed the turn points that we're going to use, mainly to avoid the weather that was predicted. So it went from an 80-mile task to much shorter. I think it was a 45 or 50-mile task. And I was feeling comfortable when I left the start area. The sun was trying to come out, and I thought it was going to become a better day. And I started heading towards the first turn point, which was not that far away, maybe 20 miles. And immediately, to my left, I see a rain squall. To my right, I see some rain, and I really considered turning back. I was only about 10 miles from the airport, from Cordele, and I did start to turn back, saying, it's just not going to be a great day. You've already had some great experiences here. Let's call it a day. Just then, two other gliders got my attention. I was heading home. They were heading out on course, and I said, well, let me follow them. If if they feel comfortable, I'll follow them for a little bit, and if it doesn't get any better, I'll make my way back. Made it to the first turn point. Things were pretty uneventful. There was decent lift, but again, you weren't flying very high. 4,000 was a good altitude. That was plenty high. When I was going from the second turn point to the third, and it was pretty much a 90-degree turn point, and you make that turn, and all I saw was rain. To the left, to the right, there was just little, the clouds were starting to condense, and rain was starting to fall. So you really had to pick your way through the rain showers. There was no lightning, but obviously you're not going to fly very well if you're flying in the rain. And there were a few times I would be under a cloud thermaling. Everything was great, and all of a sudden you'd realize, as you were going around 360 degrees, you'd realize you were flying in and out of rain, just within the thermal. It's like one side of it was raining and one side of it was sunny. I've never flown like that before, and you wanted to get out of there as quick as you could. So luckily the thermals were strong, but there was rain everywhere, little pockets of rain all over the course. And then when I did get to the third and final turn point to head home, it wasn't the rain, but the sky got very overcast at that point. And I did have final glide. I had adjusted my computer to put a larger margin now, so that I didn't make that mistake that I made earlier. But I knew I had final glide, but it's a little intimidating that it was completely overcast. You just feel nervous. You don't know what's in front of you, if you're going to hit some sink and so on. And as I was coming home at best glide, I really was not pushing the speed at all. And I did happen to actually run into another glider. He was off probably a mile to my left, and I just kind of made my way over toward him. I think it's just a psychological thing, but just the comfort of being up with another glider about your altitude, heading home, and made it home, made it back to Cordele. Not a very fast race for anybody that day. I do remember after I landed, my friend Bruce was on the ground, and he goes, how was it? How'd you like it? And I told him, I said, Bruce, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. To have flown it. I said, it just makes no sense. I knew better. I probably should have just turned around when I had initially turned around. But I said, if anybody else had told me the weather was going to be like that, I never would have flown the task. But I was excited that I completed it. A lot of gliders, they were probably smarter than me. They just bailed out early on because the weather wasn't looking too good.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, a lot of fun. I
have not, obviously, anywhere near doing a contest yet, but they do sound like a lot of fun. I am looking forward to that someday.
Everybody, and people told us that, just do it. Just get out there and do it. It's an incredible experience. Don't go there thinking you're gonna be that one in a million that wins a contest the very first time they go. But it's such a great experience. You learn a lot from the more senior guys that are there doing it. there's a briefing every morning at the pilots meeting. The three pilots, the top three finishers from the previous day, give a speech, if you will. They kind of told you what they were thinking and how they flew the day and what they look for and what's good and what's bad. That's a lifetime of experience right there. You'd hear people say some things and you're like, wow, I never would have thought about that. Somebody brought up that you're generally trained to fly over terrain that looks like it's going to generate lift, darker fields or areas that are going to generate lift for you. There in Georgia, the truth is a lot of those fields that you're looking at are wet because they're irrigated. Because that time of the year, they're starting to grow these crops and they really soak the ground. So over the open fields is not where you want to be. You want to be along a lot of the tree lines because those are actually absorbing all that heat throughout the day and they start to give it up later in the afternoon. And I had never been conditioned to do that, to think that I'm going to fly over a forest and that's going to generate more lift than that nice dark piece of ground there that looks like it's soaking up all the sunshine. That kind of experience is invaluable. You don't get that unless you're surrounded by people that have been flying for a long time and are willing to share that information.
Absolutely. Anytime I can soak up information from guys that have been flying for a while, I always try to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
Jim, thank you for sharing your experience flying a contest.
Thank you. It's been fun.
For somebody that not only wants to be a better pilot, but also a safer pilot, would you have any advice for them?
You said it a minute ago. Listen to your body. Listen to your body. It tells you what you probably can and can't do. I take that a little step further, going listen to yourself. I think a lot of times when people get in trouble, they know they're getting into a bad situation. Maybe you're flying around your home field and you see that you're getting a little low. But for example, my example of I thought I would just find some lift out ahead, and I went ahead and turned for home, even though I knew that I didn't have the altitude I needed. There was a voice in my head telling me, don't do that. I was only 10 miles to my landing point, to the previous turn point, where I could have landed at a paved runway. Somebody could have flown out there and got me, but I didn't listen to that little voice in my head that said, hey, stop where you are. Worst case, land out at this airport and be ready for the next day. I didn't listen to that voice. So the advice I would give is listen to your conscience. It's telling you a lot of times if you think it's not a good decision, it's probably not a good decision. And, always remember it's a sport. It's not there to be, it doesn't have to be any more dangerous than it is. And try and enjoy it and just be absolutely as safe as you can be.
Absolutely. There's always tomorrow to fly. Yep. You don't have to get in the air if you don't feel like it's not a good time.
That's right. One of the members at our club, and it still stands out in my mind, that concept of I'm going to skip this cloud. There was no lift here, so I'm going to go to the next cloud. There'll be some lift under that one or, this next area. And he said it. He goes, hey, sometimes tomorrow never comes. You keep skipping those clouds, and pretty soon there's no more clouds left, and you can't get any higher, and you have to land. So sometimes tomorrow never comes. You just gotta stop and be thoughtful. Take what you have and try and work with the conditions that you're in, and always be safe. It's a sport. Don't try and do something that's going to endanger you or even the people on the ground around you. Make it as fun and enjoyable as possible.
Yeah, so we can enjoy the next day of flying.
Yep, absolutely. Tell more stories the next day, right?
Jim, thank you for taking your time. I appreciate you being on the podcast. It's been good talking to you.
Thank you for doing this. These podcasts, I think, are really valuable and a great source of experience for anybody that's listening to them. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another great guest here on Soaring the Sky, and thank you for all your positive feedback you've been sending us from all over the globe. I do appreciate it. If you are a pilot and you'd like to share your story here on the podcast, feel free to get a hold of me. It's Chuck at soaringthesky.com. Love to hear from you, love to talk to you, get you on the podcast. If you want to catch up with us on social media, you can do that. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Both of those, you can find us at Soaring the Sky Podcast. We also put some things on there about upcoming guests, so you get a little bit of sneak peek. And once again, if you want more information about soaring, a great place to go is ssa.org. We hope you join us again next time right here for another great guest on Soaring the Sky.